Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first of the afternoon sessions. Just want to check, because we've got one speaker that's joining us remotely. Dr. Hoffman, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you if you can hear me.
Can, and we can see you. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, well, this morning we actually discussed the significance of partnerships, of effectively integrating the physical and digital worlds, and the importance of data in improving transparency, reliability, and enhancing planning decisions. This afternoon, we're going to sort of drill a little bit more into the detail, into trades, into ports, and into terminals. And I just want to give a very short introduction. But firstly, we're going to take a look at the current and future trade routes. And I've got 4 speakers this afternoon that are going to give us their perspective on how the trades are structured, what changes we might see in terms of the services and the trades being offered, and also in terms of any changes that may be afoot in terms of port calls and hub strategies. Again, we heard this morning that COVID-19 has certainly disrupted supply chains across the world. They've disrupted surface patterns, and we've also seen cargo taking a lot longer to move from A to B. And for most cargo owners, they've had to accept much longer delivery times and also significantly higher freight rates. But it's also led to a lot less connectivity. We're seeing fewer direct services between ports. We're seeing much higher exchanges in some ports rather than others, leading to a situation where some ports are very congested and others do have some spare capacity. So, do we see some changes to this strategy? Do we see a move, for example, of services from congested US West Coast ports to US East Coast ports? Do we see any adjustments to the hub ports that are currently being used by some of the major operators? We recently saw that Hapag-Lloyd was investing in T2 in Damietta and would use that as their main hub for the Eastern Mediterranean. Do we see more developments of that nature? So I'm hoping our speakers this afternoon are going to address some of these issues and give us some insight into how they see future trading patterns and future hub strategies. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Jan Hoffman as our first speaker. Dr. Hoffman is Chief of Trade Logistics Branch at UNCTAD, and he's responsible for the directive in implementing multilateral and trade facilitation programs. And I understand that the title of his presentation is The Chicken and the Egg, Shipping Services and Global Value Chains. Dr. Hoffman, over to you.
Yes, very happy to be back to talk. Thank you, John, colleagues. Would have loved to be with you in person, but then, well, the usual limitations. Yeah, the chicken and the egg, the idea is really to share some thoughts from our work on the linkages between these global value chains and transport, or what comes first, the demand for trade or the shipping services. Of course, it often goes in both directions. So yes, there you have some chicken, and the causality is circular. More trade leads to economies of scale, leads to lower trade costs, leads to more trade. And the long-term trend, by just way of example, we have this UNCTAD Liner Shipping Connectivity Index, a measure of showing how well countries on average or ports are connected with the fleet deployment, number of services, number of companies, deployed capacity, and so on. So the world average went up. Since 2006, we are doing this. Trade is going up, but not for everybody. So already here at the bottom, we have put countries that are very important for us at UNCTAD, the small island developing states, and many of them are stuck at low connectivity. There's not enough connectivity to make them competitive to trade. There's not enough trade to make the shipping companies come. And among the large number of SIDS, the small island developing states we cover, there are three that had been growing over time thanks to becoming hub ports: Jamaica, Bahamas, Mauritius. They had been growing thanks to providing service to the foreign trade of other countries. And there too, if you look at the last 3 quarters, and this is already up to the current quarter, the fleet deployment, you do see they also suffer from this, was John just described, some redeployment of capacity from south to north, and then the capacity is waiting in front of other ports. So I find this is an interesting chart. It goes in line with, again, John also mentioned the fewer direct services. In fact, here we have the number of ports in our database, the number of ports served by liner shipping services. You see over the years, up to shortly before COVID, it went up, long-term trend. Then it started going down. So some ports were dropped. And now with the war in Ukraine, there are, of course, additional ports in the Black Sea that have been dropped. So I think this is an interesting chart just in the total number of ports covered by the liner shipping network. So that was a positive correlation. Now, you can also have more demand plus COVID leading to congestion. We calculated the median time container ships spent in port globally, latest and pre-COVID, plus 19.6%, like plus 20% order of magnitude. 20% longer in port, while the long-term trend had been declining. No? So that's certainly bad news. And here I'm sharing with you a chart that we have just uploaded last week for an upcoming expert meeting. I find this a very interesting chart. Let us spend a minute on this one. So what is the impact of higher increased container freight rates on prices? And we all know, we in this business, we've always said, oh no, it's cheaper to get a bottle of wine from Australia to Hamburg than from Hamburg to Berlin by truck. Yes, it is still very low, but the freight rates are so high, and I come back also to the type of product, that we simulate now, we estimate that we have all seen inflation, and there's 1.6 percentage points, the bar on the right, the world average, 1.6 percentage points additional consumer price increase as a result of the higher freight rates. We had done a similar simulation mid last year when we did not have inflation yet. So we simulated this, and there we had said plus 1.5%. And then the IMF, International Monetary Fund, measures it a few months ago and says plus 1.5% of the inflation is due to higher freight rates. Now here you have them again, the SIDS, the small island developing states. You also have the LDCs, the least developed countries, and the LADCs are the landlocked countries. So of course, landlocked countries trade less by sea and more by land. They are not as strongly affected. But the SIDS, the small island states that depend so much on shipping, that have so little alternatives, that already pay 2 to 3 times more for their freight rates, they are really heavily impacted by the high freight rates. Now, I said I would also say a few words about the type of products. This is from our last year's review of maritime transport. Basically, there are 2 types of products that are most strongly impacted by the higher freight rates. One are, you would say, high volume, low value products. Here, say furniture or other manufacturing, like plastic furniture, garden furniture, whatever. So there, the freight rate can make up a high share of the value of the goods. Yeah, even. Now, the other ones, computer, electronics, optical products, for example, they are impacted not because the freight rate is so high compared to the value of the goods, but because while we produce those goods in the global value chain, they add up. So you import some lens from Korea to Vietnam, then some bit and piece from Vietnam to Thailand, from Thailand to China. So this adds up, and there also we have this big impact. Another chart I wanted to share, which I hope you agree and find interesting. This is not yet published. This is for an upcoming assessment we do, the impact of the war in the Ukraine. This is very much focused on grains. So the impact of higher dry bulk freight rates and global grain prices, so 2 things, on consumer food prices. Same methodology we had before on the container. And what I found really interesting here, order of magnitude, roughly half of the price increase for the world consumer, you see on the left the bar, so 3.7% higher food prices globally, about half of it is the blue part, which is higher bulk freight rates. And the orange part are higher commodity prices because there's not all the grain can leave Ukraine and higher commodity prices. But I found it surprisingly high. Wow, there's half of this increase is due to freight rates. Now, one more thing, because we are here interested in global value chains. Why are low income countries, like the poorest, the least developed countries, why is for them the impact of the freight rate, the blue one, not that high? Because they don't import that much the raw, the bulk, the maize, the corn, the wheat. They are so underdeveloped, they don't even produce their own pasta, pizza, foodstuffs, chocolate bars, what have you. So they have to import the produced food. They don't import the raw materials. I find this an interesting example from a global value chain perspective in a way, and I thought I shared with you. It's not yet public, might change bits and pieces, but the key message I find very interesting. So going back to something more positive, better logistics lead to more trade, lead to development, lead to better logistics. That's a study we did a few years ago about correlation. Now, those people who confuse correlation and causality, all those people who confuse correlation and causality, they will eventually die. So here I have shown you some correlation, which is correlation between trade facilitation on the one hand and GDP, trade facilitation and Human Development Index, trade facilitation and internet connection, and also between trade facilitation and less corruption. Meaning, if I have better and more trade facilitation, more single windows, more transparency, more automation, more e-payments, more transparency above all, then I have, so if I have more trade facilitation, I have less corruption. The index there goes in the positive. So what is the causality? I think it goes both ways. The causality, of course, if I am less corrupt as a country, I'm more likely to promote trade facilitation reforms. And if I promote trade facilitation reform that make trade easier, smoother, more transparent, then I reduce corruption. So that is what we are working on. So the chicken has become a swan, perhaps a black swan. Our solutions, UNCTAD, we work on trade facilitation, on transport policy legislation, on infrastructure services, on our research. I hope all of you know our review of maritime transport, our trade facilitation platforms. We have programs on customs automation. Almost 100 countries use ASICUDA. We have a new program here, ASI-Hub, which is about maritime single windows. We have programs on ports. And in a way, our approach, why are we doing this? And I have to thank all of you, those of you who pay taxes, you are paying my salary. Thank you very much. So that's our work. And this is all about the dynamic nature of trade, transport facilitation, and development. Countries that trade more will find it easier to attract the money and the investment. And of course, those that invest will afterwards trade more. Those countries that have more financial resources, well, they have more money, they can invest, and they generate more revenue thanks to better trade facilitation. Those countries that have better, stronger human, institutional, technological capacities will then also be able to attract the trade facilitation reforms. That's what we are working on. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ian. Very interesting presentation. Confirmation there that basically connectivity levels have generally declined. Number of direct port services has declined. And I think very significant, the fact that these high freight rates are beginning to have more of an impact on consumer prices as well. So I think plenty there for us to discuss later on in the Q&A. So next on the podium, I'd like to welcome Johan Paul Verschuri, Project Director of the Rebel Group, and he's going to be talking about redeploying and rerouting shipping capacity. Johan, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, John. Perfect. Good to be here back again, seeing you all on stage. From the stage, sorry, in the room. Before joining Rebel here in Holland, I spent quite a bit of time in England, so I got used to using the weather for expressing, what we think about everything. And we're going to talk about the redeploying and rerouting of the shipping patterns. And I think it's being summarized by the expression cloudy with the risk of a thunderstorm. So can go any direction, but there's definitely something brewing, which is a bit of a risk. And I'm going to talk you through a couple of slides, especially with data, hopefully that it's of interest to you, that I'm going to try to have you convinced or share my thoughts on this, and hope to hear some questions on you. I think my presentation ties in quite nicely where we ended the previous session from this morning about port disruption, what are the drivers, where it's going. So I would like to start with a map. Which is on. I think I pressed every button on the thing. Maybe someone in the back can put like the next slide on. There we go. We'll go right away to the next slide again. So, port congestion, topic of the entire floor. I think everyone has seen these kind of maps, or where's the port congestion. The only thing what I wanted to point out during this presentation is it has been a very dynamic couple of months. So this map was one of October 2021. So this was the story of when Long Beach and LA, there were queues with vessels there. Also the East Coast, we saw massive problems also here across Europe. And what the map shows is the size of the bubble is the vessel capacity at anchorage relative to what the port capacity is. So it's just like the bigger the port, if you have a big red bubble with a big port, massive problems. If you have a green bubble with a big port, it can still be that there are quite a few vessels outside, but it's kind of normal. So this was October. So let's switch to last Friday, when we updated the analysis for the last time. My thing is still not working, so maybe in the back they can move on to the next slide. The situation has changed. So the shipping routes on port congestion is entirely a different story. So let's start on the US side, where we previously saw the West Coast. It's getting very interesting now. I'm not sure if this is a hint to get off the stage very quickly, but I hope not. I'll talk in the meanwhile, but if we look at the North American market, what we see is that the problems have shifted quite dramatically from the West Coast to the East Coast. So the West Coast actually, queues have disappeared. There are several reasons for it. One is obviously the lockdowns in China causing lower volumes coming across. Secondly is also that quite a few, as a result of the disruption in the last fall, people have moved volumes to the East Coast to serve, for example, the Midwest. But also the upcoming negotiations or expiring of the union agreements on the West Coast, people are a little bit more careful with events in the past to route their volumes over the West Coast. East Coast, though, has seen quite a bit of more problems. I'll talk about that in the next slide as well. More interestingly also, what I also find interesting is if we zoom in on the European side, whereas in last fall, the port congestion was quite spread out across all ports, all kind of having the same kind of issues. It's actually quite concentrated on the North German ports, and it's not so much all the things that we've seen in the press. It's not so much the typical capacity and all those kind of trouble, but in Hamburg and Bremerhaven, it's a strike. It's volumes for heading also to Russia, and some volumes waiting to be exported to Asia. Whereas, for example, the situation in quite a few other ports is actually much more moderate. Obviously, needless to say, China is reversed. Last autumn, it was kind of relatively okay. but now it's much bigger. This is the situation of last week, where the situation in April was much more severe, so the bubbles were actually quite big. What we see is actually that the situation in Asia has changed also over time quite dramatically again, or quite fast in the good way to reduce congestion again. That topic I'm going to touch upon in the next slide. Got good eye contact in the back now. Or actually one before. Yeah, this one. If this is data I was very kindly given by Kuehne Nagel with their global trade pattern and how they measure all the kind of logistic parameters, KPIs. I'll give you a snapshot of, this is all the data of last week, what is going on. In the top part, you see the average waiting time for vessels before entering. This is not only like congestion, but also vessels sometimes do show up a bit earlier or around their berthing window, so there's always a bit of time on there. And actually what the picture was last fall was that the US ports were much higher, and actually that has reduced quite a bit. It also shows that Bremerhaven and Hamburg are having at the moment some issues, but obviously when those kind of issues have resolved, we expect also that things normalize a bit. Then on the bottom, there's a bit more information also on the trends, where it's going and how it's relatively to each other. I had to scale down and increase the size of the charts because... Sorry? Yeah, sorry, days. Yeah, days. Also on the bottom, so it's taken from their platform, and to get all the scales on the right-hand side, some are a little bit larger, so effectively, the larger the chart, the longer the waiting time. You can also interpret it in that way. And what you can actually see is on the West Coast, so the left three charts, actually the waiting time is decreasing, and this trend was not only on the last week, but it's actually is over a couple of weeks already. Whereas the East Coast is actually upward, so we see more trouble on Savannah, New York. And this is also, again, is an indication of how shipping lines are redeploying their volumes from west to east. Obviously, intuitively, people say, well, it must be a big problem also in the Chinese ports or the Asian ports. But actually, from the data in terms of the waiting time, it's not extremely bad. Again, April was much worse, so it's improving at the moment, but it's not the biggest problem. The way the vessels are skipping the ports, that also helps, so it's not showing up in the data for that reason. There's a problem on the trucking side, so more inland with a bit of a problem. But yeah, okay, that's those kind of aspects, but it has improved significantly, and that's also tying in with what Lamia was saying in the first session, that actually we see the vessels coming in with the volumes coming in at the moment. So if we go to the next slide, what is also interesting from the same data is if we look at the global situation of the disruption. So I think if we read the press, there's a tendency of saying, well, port congestion is port congestion, and it's still there, so the articles are still touching upon this. But measuring by the ports and the vessels that Kuehne Nagel are covering globally, which is a large data set, there's some interesting developments. So what we see on the right bottom on the chart is the vessel capacity times the time vessels are stuck behind outside the port. So if a 200,000 TEU vessel is stuck for a day, it adds as a 200,000 TEU vessel. This is all added up for all the ports across the world, split out. The blue line is North American ports, the black line is the global situation, and the left part of the chart starts in December 2021, so over half a year ago. Then where the chart stops is pretty much when the war broke out around Ukraine. And on the right, this is again data from last week. That's where we are now. I think there are two interesting things that clearly stand out. It's that we've come down with port congestion in terms of how many vessels are waiting outside quite a lot, depending on whether you take the peak or whether you take the kind of the plateau there. We're talking about 2/3. So there are 2/3 less vessels waiting in terms of capacity times time of waiting. And the second part is also that the share of North American ports actually decreased quite a bit, but is still quite large. So it's roughly 50% North America. I would say it's 25% Asian ports and 25% other ports, but there's definitely a tendency down. More interesting part is actually that this doesn't show up that much in the spot rate markets just yet. So obviously, if there's still congestion, there's still a lack of capacity, so you still have the same problem of finding a spot on the vessel. But if this gets much lower, at some point, there will be spare capacity, and that's when the backlog can be cleared up. So in my view, we're nearing this point where the damage that was caused by the last several months can actually be cleared up, and actually that situation can actually change quite dramatically. I think also in this data, it's not only anymore the COVID problems that we've read all about, but it's also starting to get all kind of other problems like the strikes, Germany, also South Korea, there's strikes in the port going on, or the truck drivers, and we see that more and more. Here in Northwest Europe, we see also problems on airports, other infrastructure, and I think in an inflationary environment, together with port labors and the pressure on the wages, I think that's probably the first couple, and there might be even more when more union negotiations are coming up. Conscious of time, I'll skip the last 2 points, but it will be interesting to think about, probably we need to build in a bit more resilience for this increased volatility to deal with these peaks and troughs, but who's going to pay for that? It's a catch-22, private operators are probably not going to do it, so who will be taking care of the next pushes up or down? If we go to the next slide. So we see disruption clearing, or clearing, it's not gone, but it's to some extent, I believe it's less. We see also this morning, Peter showed quite a few nice charts on trade or demand growth on different trades. We see the main east-west trade, actually, there wasn't much growth over the last 2 years, or we're back to 2019 levels, or how you want to put it. Obviously, to the US it was a different story, but also there, it seems to kind of stabilize. But then, and I think this chart, also for the people in the room this morning, Peter also had the same chart on with data from Clarkson's. The order book has exploded over the last 2 years with a lot of capacity coming in 2023. There was less scrapping, so we'll see that the actual shipping capacity will go up quite a bit. Then we have the point that there's less vessels waiting outside, so in terms, in a certain way, they're able to dock faster, or not waiting outside at least. And then there's the big elephant in the room of what's going to come in the second half of the year in terms of recession, lower growth, or people spending less, not buying their things on Amazon. And if you add those two together, it sounds actually very familiar to probably some 10 years ago, when also pre-crisis, big investment in shipping capacity, and then a reduction in demand. And the question starts to come up is maybe, that can actually bite. Obviously, the disruption will still cause, for a while, capacity taken out because of the longer transit times. But the question is how long, and especially I think the problem shifted towards the hinterland trucking. If those situations can be solved in terms of better conditions, or drivers, or everything that's being looked at in terms of policy, how to boost that. If also the containers move out of the gates in a faster way, together with a couple percentage lower growth in there, we could actually see again the same cocktail of 10 years ago. And I would like to then tie in with the words of Indra in the first section. It can also be very well that we're actually in this cycle again, and this is again a similar tipping point. I think it greatly depends on all kind of political situations in terms of and inflation drivers, which I cannot predict, so it's not certain. But if the conflict goes on for longer and we see demand actually dropping, I think there's going to be a problem again. And then it comes down to in which segment, because the vessel orders have been on the mainline vessels, but we also see shift in production. I'll touch upon that topic a little bit later. So if we go to the next slide. So longer port stays, there's also a topic on different shipping deployment over the last couple of years. Actually, it was also mentioned in the session this morning by Eleanor and Lamia, actually with different views on it. So I'm going to weigh in on that discussion. I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts. And Jan also said, like, average port stays globally is about 20%. I think we came up with 16%, but we have a data set. I don't think we cover 950 ports as Jungtal is. What you see in the charts are 3 lines. It's a set of ports in the US, set of ports in the Europe. It's the blue line. The red line is US, and the green line is Asia. We see the port says actually there's a different increase in how long vessels are staying at the terminals. So this is only the terminal time. It's not the waiting time. You can have different conclusions on that. But this is the time at the berth. And if you bring that down, if you look at what the parcel size over the number of containers exchanged per vessel call are, what you see is actually that in all 3 geographies, it has increased. But in Asia and Europe, the most, by about 12%. And in the US, the difference was 7 by the looks of it. But if you compare that to the total port stay, there's a whole big range left for US ports for other reasons for the longer port stays other than the increased volumes. But if you compare that with EU and Asia, actually most of the explanation for longer port stays was bigger volumes per container and not extremely much about productivity. There is a bit, a difference per terminal, different per port. Obviously, we're taking a snapshot on the European market as a whole, but actually that difference is not extremely large. So longer port stays doesn't necessarily say ports that don't operate well. Obviously, there was problems with congestion, but quite a few terminals were actually dealing with it quite nicely, in my view. And part of that is also trickling down in the reliability indices that a lot of people are quoting and as an indication of you see how bad it is. But what actually a lot of liners did is the shipping network in Northwest Europe consists of several port calls across, and they reduced that to 1 or 2. By doing so, you take out time of calling at a different port, you take out the risk of extra delays, all those kind of things. So they went into a model with port-to-port calls rather than the loops. Obviously, that means that you're dropping ports, you're staying beyond or around your berthing window, you get all those kind of problems. Big problems for the terminal operators, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the vessels weren't sailing or weren't carrying your cargo. They were taking a different model, and obviously the index is just calculating versus what has been planned. So dropping reliability indices was also probably a reason that actually the liners were dealing with it in a very efficient or flexible way, like as a hypothesis. I know that some people have a different view, but I think this was actually a way of dealing with this situation. Also, like Eleanor also mentioned this morning, was that they made advantage of dropping your containers once in a while in a different port or ending up in a different port, and thereby making use of a very strong feeder network across the ports. This feeder network resulted that there was a lot of unpredictability, but actually the volumes were kind of reshifted, and the congestion was borne by a set of ports. And this system wasn't applicable in the US because it's not possible. It's with the Jones Act, it's much more difficult. Those kind of things. So also the policies that were in place in North America actually caused that it was much more difficult to deal with the volatility that was caused by the COVID situation. So also the reliability indices, in my view, is not a sign of that all the shipping lines are doing a very poor job, but it's also perhaps partly explained by taking a new route. And also that will also explain a dropping in connectivity, because then you have less feeders to different ports, or you have a reshuffling of those kind of things. So it's a different interpretation of the same data based on what I believe was going on with the different shipping liners. So if we move on to the next one, this will be the last slide also. I think there were 5 trends also which are worth noting about the rerouting, and this is a bit for the medium to longer term. What we've seen last year is a re-emergence of smaller shipping lines, whether it was Lidl or Amazon chartering network. We see those kind of things. Also, what Jan was alluding to, a lot of islands are suffering from the connectivity because the big shipping lines were not connecting to the smaller islands, and thereby are looking to start new shipping lines or those kind of things. So I think the strategic reason for operating your shipping line is back on the agenda. It will depend on all the reasons that I alluded to before, whether financially there will be a very long-term good situation, or whether they will go back to being acquired and consolidated into bigger ones. The second one, and that's a very interesting, I think a lot of people are looking into that now, is the diversification of supply chains, whether it's moving from China to Vietnam or to Malaysia, but also other production locations. For example, in Central America is actually on the cards, especially in the North American cases, where they are looking for different production locations. So what actually can make that result in is that we'll see bigger ports having a slower growth, and the medium-sized ports actually have a larger demand. So we see that perhaps the overall demand is the same, but it's relocating in the supply chains, and thereby also causing a different problem with the vessels calling at those ports, whether the facilities, for example, in Vietnam will be enough in terms of capacity, and also if they have the right vessels. So there will be specific vessel segments that are probably seeing a lot more demand than the other ones. We believe that the largest vessels will probably see a bit of a problem with lower volumes on the main trades, and the medium-sized vessels actually increase in demand, and there it is a bit reflected by, if you look at the order books, that those segments actually see more vessels being ordered, but we believe that there will still be a little bit of stress in that segment. Third part, nearshoring, is widely discussed. It's a solution for now. It's everyone talks about in the same kind of way that in the beginning of the COVID crisis, everyone thought like, what's going on? When will it result? But the problem with the nearshoring is that whenever the situation improves again, the other competitors will start to look at reducing the cost of your production again. Probably will go back to the outsourcing problem, and you'll get into the same catch-22 as with all kind of other things with transport. So nearshoring for now, when supply chains are a bit more difficult, it's a good solution, but you're making those decisions for long term. So I think nearshoring for a whole lot of products is actually not worth it. However, there are some products, and especially with a strategic character, where it can actually be a very interesting opportunity. And thereby, those kind of changes will obviously have a bit of a result, but it will be less big than, for example, for all clothing or all kind of standard consumer goods. Fourth part is actually in the, unfortunately, a little bit longer term. Since last week, is whether emissions will be accounted for in the shipping patterns, or in the road transport and in the shipping transport. When emissions have to be paid for, or like when it's included in the ETS, for example, here in Europe, what the effect will be is that ports with a closer proximity to key demand centers will actually see a boost in their demand relatively. Because the per TEU emissions of shipping that are lower than of hinterland transport, you want to reduce that hinterland concept. So if you look at the economic benefits, and also for a lot of policy papers that we're actually writing in terms of getting permits for new ports, this is a new argument saying a port closer to your demand center, even perhaps more ports, smaller, but more ports closer to various cities, will actually reduce your CO2 impact, and thereby the cost of those emissions. And we start with CO2, but there are a whole lot of other emissions which are actually quite highly valued in terms of valuation, so in terms of nitrogen, sulfur, and those kind of missing. The last part, also request from the conference, our view on the Arctic shipping route, we don't see that trend that much picking up, and mostly because of a reliability issue in terms of whether that route has ice or not. And I think a lot of liners will not be able to count on that for the annual schedules. Having a summerly schedule and a winterly schedule is already complicated, but then whether it starts in October or November will becoming more problematic. And especially also the image risk that a lot of shipping liners are probably facing will be too much. I think there's probably low value bulk goods that probably want to make use of it, and probably also have a closer relationship to countries that are bordering it, where a lot of people have perhaps some more difficulties with. But I suppose for the container lines, we don't see that as the big trend coming up. So this was in summary the points we have from shipping line. Happy to take questions after the last presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. Again, a lot of takeouts in that presentation, particularly like some of your thinking with regard to some of the rerouting strategies that may be employed and the drivers behind that, the near sourcing, the emissions and need to reduce the environmental impact of transport, and also the diversification of supply chains. I think there's going to be some active debate, hopefully, on those issues. I was also feeling quite good when you mentioned that the port congestion and the ship waiting times was coming down, but then to add the fact that you thought with slowing demand and the reduction in that port congestion, we could end up in an oversupply situation. That was quite worrying. But I suppose thunderstorm rather than hurricane probably sums up your presentation. So thank you very much indeed. So I'm moving on to the next speaker. Dennis Kogabon, HPC Hamburg Port Consulting, and I think his presentation is entitled Integrated Ports, Extended Supply Chain Thinking as a Competitive Advantage. So welcome to the podium.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. And also, John, thanks for the heads up that this may not work. So thanks for being the guinea pig here. I guess following on from two of the previous sessions, there have been a few sort of key aspects where one might think, we're probably in for an interesting ride, especially for the not so major terminals or ports in the world where you see a lot of, be it either entirely blank sailings, which obviously for the smaller terminals matter if they don't have in total so many sailings, and or where individual ports get dropped quite regularly, and that they're obviously sort of more prone if it's the smaller ones. And it's not just the islands. I've just been to New Zealand, for example, where predictability on import and export connectivity is at an all-time low. And what I would try to do is, lift the mood from the partial misery we might have looked at thus far, and try to think about, is there an opportunity, what can we do in order to not only retain or secure volumes, but also think about a competitive advantage by extended supply chain thinking. As I go through this, after the first two slides, you'll be thinking, well, everybody's doing it, so how is their competitive advantage? Then I'll be arguing, well, I've only spoken about the big ones, and I'll show you two very distinct case studies where extended supply chains and their integration has actually helped the terminal operator or the port to prosper over time, and then obviously have a closing statement on key takeaways. So I'll give this one try to flip the... Was that me? Well done. Why am I here? Why do I stand here? What we cover is basically, we despite the name Hamburg Port Consulting, we obviously cover more than just ports and terminals. We look into hinterland connectivity and have done a lot of work in that. And as you see, all the planning that goes into it, making sense of the commercials around it, how also to make sure people talk to each other through a system to reduce lack of visibility, hence enable better informed decision making is something that we cover. So that makes me confident that I'll go through this presentation smoothly enough. And I want to show you a bit of an overview of a lot of colorful blobs, basically, just showing a range of operators and their level of integration across the various sort of sectors and areas. Like, from freight forwarding all the way to hinterland connectivity. What are the areas that people are invested in, at least on paper, I shall say, all the way to IT solutions? Now, without necessarily going through all the very colorful blobs on this slide and explaining each and every one of them individually, what you will find is, and also as you read through the news pretty much every week these days, you will find that the major players who somehow, are part of a terminal operator or have terminal operations somehow in their portfolio start spreading or have spread over the last couple of years throughout the supply chain. Now, there's a great value in this because obviously we speak about blank sailings, we speak about delays, we speak about increase in dwell time and all that. Now, obviously, the more you control of that chain, the more informed decision making you're enabled to do, and also you can start managing not only performance but also capacities. So with that, what some of us learned in university or heard about as the bullwhip effect can actually be managed through the organization. What's fair to say, though, is some of them listed here, if you speak to them, they're probably not as integrated in reality as they are on paper. So whilst they will be covering large parts of the chain, in reality, there will be a lot of instances where you will get a terminal handling service, you will get a warehouse service, but the full view on integration is probably not there. Now, there is one operator that is sort of swimming against that sort of stream. You probably can't help but notice that ICTSI is very focused on terminal operations, and has been so, and has, according to latest discussions we've had with them, no intention to change that, because they say we want to focus on what we can do best, which is the terminal operations, whereas all the others, one way or another, are sort of spreading across the chain. Now, looking at that, as I said, you might think, well, those are all the big ones. So, aren't we, by definition, by not being necessarily one of these big ones, discouraged? Is it actually a fair fight? And I really, as I said, want to show you two good examples. And from what we've heard with waiting ships in Hamburg, I'm actually quite pleased I didn't choose Hamburg. But you'll be hearing about Charleston first, and then we'll be speaking about one of the ports in New Zealand, just to make the case there is a potential for almost everybody to engage in extended supply chain thinking and consider where's the competitive advantage of that. Now, Charleston, South Carolina is running from one, volume record to the other. So if you follow their activity in the media, you will find that over the last couple of months, every month there's been another sort of record. Now, that's obviously also partly related to, some of the shifts from the West Coast to the East Coast. Over the last couple of years, there have been a few very distinct strategic investments by the organization into providing what I would call supply chain solutions to specific cargo owners. They're in specifically BMW, and you'd think, okay, so Spartanburg in South Carolina is BMW's biggest production plant. All the X models. So if you happen to drive a BMW X something, you would have contributed to this supply chain solution to work, because they're all built in Spartanburg at a capacity of about 450,000 units a year. What Charleston has done is they provide the capacity not only to offload containers, which carry all the components out of which cars are made at the end, but also they strategically implemented in Greer, which is only 30 kilometers from Spartanburg, an inland terminal with supporting warehousing infrastructure from where just-in-time delivery for that massive automobile plant is enabled. Now, the port itself being more than 300 kilometers away from that production site, there wouldn't have been a chance to have reliable just-in-time delivery to the production site. So by choosing this node, they have actually tied their operations to the specific needs of the BMW plant. And the great thing about car manufacturing is you do have components coming in, and ideally at the end of the production, you have cars coming out that 60% of those get exported outside of the US. So that creates, mostly not containerized, but that creates the cargo flow back to the port. And what the port has thus been able to do is not only tie a client and all the containerized cargo to come in through Charleston, also through the inland operations in Greer, they obviously extend their percentage in their customers' wallet share, or spending. And then obviously they benefit from the cars coming back to have them loaded on ships and go out. Now, that has worked to an extent where others, as you see, Michelin Tires, the US largest solar module producer, the name I don't remember, if I'm honest, have actually set up similar operations right next to where the BMW plant is. Now, Walmart's about to set up a major distribution center in the region. Why? Because the initial connectivity has been there from the BMW plant. And as far as distance goes, cargo might as well just have come through Savannah, for example, as well. From hinterland transport distance and cost perspective, it wouldn't have been much of a difference. Now, one of the components here is extended supply chain thinking. You might think, well, they surely run their own trains. They don't. Norfolk Southern basically provides the service for them, but obviously with a frequency and reliability and according to service levels that the operator or the Port Authority, and which is the same in the case of Charleston, needs it, to basically provide that reliable scheduled service between the port and the facility. And as I mentioned, with the increase in volume, you create a frequency. Frequency is key, not only for shipping line connections, but also for trains to make it attractive for others to follow through. And this has now become one of the main growth areas, basically, for Charleston to attract more cargo. Now, that's still quite big. Let's trim it down. Littleton. Like to speak about Littleton for two reasons. A, it's a fantastic part of the world, but also they always have to think very carefully how they can actually set up supply chain solutions that are going to be competitive in a global environment. It's long transport distances, and it's simply at the end of the world. Now, Littleton, when we speak about Christchurch, Port of Littleton, we're talking about annual throughput of just over 400,000 TEU. And that's why I bring it up, because Charleston, multi-million, all the global operators, they control millions of TEUs in container handling. These guys don't. So what's really key to their success and growth story is they have determined industry-specific supply chain solutions and assessed for each and every one of them individually where they have a right to play and what they can do to have a better service offering than rival ports, to secure the cargo, and secondly also make sure it's viable for importers and exporters to actually be attracted by the global market. And I'm really going to focus on the dairy sector here. A lot of the milk powder that gets exported, New Zealand's the biggest exporter of milk powder in the world, and from where it's produced, it has to be transported to a port. And given the distances, it could literally be any port. Now, what Christchurch has done is they've set up in a strategic location, actually only 60 kilometers of the port, a consolidation facility that is linked to a warehouse for one of the main dairy producers, And in that warehouse, they actually take over control of the handling and distribution of their dairy products. So from the warehouse onwards, it's all in the hands of the terminal operator to move the cargo from there through the inland port to the terminal, onto the ship, and then off it goes. Now, there are two major advantages. By taking over control during that consolidation period, they start being able to manage capacity because they have an inland terminal and they have a very, very space-constrained terminal. Now, in case they hadn't taken over the control from the warehouse onwards, given the dairy makes up about just over 20% of the annual volumes they handle, they would have had to expand a long time ago in the port. So what they've been able to do is not only increase the performance, reliability, and competitiveness for the dairy sector international connectivity, but also they've been able to help themselves additionally by deferring some of their investments whilst obviously retaining these massive volumes. What's the next step for them? They are currently in discussions, the port and the dairy producer and exporter, of whether or not some of the value-added services should be performed in New Zealand rather than in the destination countries or markets. Why is that important? If they turn milk powder into the finished products, you're multiplying the cargo volumes to be exported by factor 10. Why is that critical? The next step for Christchurch to expand is a massively expensive construction of a new berth, which in the current circumstances they cannot afford. So it's really that supply chain integrated thinking that unlocks opportunities for them to increase the number of containers they handle, to maximize which part of their network they use in order to manage capacities and provide adequate service levels at the lowest cost basically in the New Zealand-based supply chain. The other thing I will say, and I said the dairy sector and where the cargo goes doesn't really, it doesn't really matter whether it goes to one port or another. In terms of de-risking, by setting up and controlling the hinterland network, you might as well just reroute the cargo to another port. Now, they wouldn't be participating or they wouldn't have a contribution from the terminal handling charge if it was a rival port. They would still have earnings from controlling the hinterland logistics. So even that as a fallback solution gives them a stronger position in the market, which is why I feel, the combination of the specifics of that market, but also the very small size of the operation compared to some of the other terminals in the world, is where I feel, it's worthwhile sharing to look at these sectors specifically. And they're now starting to work on which I personally find very interesting, a wine sector strategy to basically provide similar services, not quite the same volumes yet, but they're obviously looking at that as well. So I guess what I want to say with that is I can only encourage each and everybody to look at, especially where it's smaller ports where there may be a risk of being left out in the services as we've just seen it and as we realize it from the statistics that's happening now. How can we position ourselves to create supply chain solutions for industries or clients specifically to add value, not just for the clients to improve their competitiveness, but also obviously in turn because it ties cargo to the terminal and it is an additional revenue source. Now, what I would have loved to show is what's actually the financial impact of these strategies on the numbers. You can't show that for all those big terminal operators that have a shipping line affiliation just because they make a whole lot of money from other parts of the business currently. And the ones we've been showing here, they've undergone massive internal optimization and reorganization projects so that all the numbers are a bit sort of skewed. But but it does add, obviously, sort of earnings per TEU handled, and that sort of leads me on to this one. If you think about doing that, just don't think in isolation, oh, there's, an option 1, 2, 3 I want to pursue, and then it sort of makes sense. Have a look at what you really want to control, where's your right to play, and where you can actually have a positive impact on the business. So what this shows is an example of 6 different components that could potentially be controlled. As you see, I'm not saying which ones they are. Under different scenarios of ownership and control, what's actually the total contribution to net profit after taxes for an organization? And without going into those numbers specifically, extended supply chain thinking as a competitive advantage. If it should be a competitive advantage, it's all about making more money. So please don't leave this and think about any expansion to your reach in the supply chain without being very sure that there's a positive financial case in there. At the end of the day, it's all about reducing uncertainty, increasing control of the cargo that flows through your port, which obviously it's supposed to have a net profit impact. Now, 4 key takeaways. I felt like 4, that's probably the number I at least sort of could remember. Integration is becoming a standard, theoretically, as I said. So most of the organizations are sort of doing it on paper. When you really drill down, there is a lot of opportunity to be uncovered in the different organizations that claim to be already very integrated. If you look at how well they actually perform it as a service already, then integration is not dependent on size. Hence, I brought the Christchurch case. Obviously, you have to have a specific anchor client or sector that you can serve, but you don't have to be a 5 million TEU facility operator to make it pay. Then there's indirect components and gains, which is capacity gains by managing the capacities you have across the chain better, which leads to investment deferral, which is going to make the financial department and CFO very happy. And then lastly, as I said for Christchurch, the supply chain solution has a value in itself, irrespective of whether or not it ties the cargo long-term to the port. With that, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Very interesting concept there, and very interesting the 2 examples you gave as well. Thank you very much. So moving on to our final speaker of this session, I'd like to invite Antonio Barbara. He's the CEO of Hala PLT Italy. This is a new container terminal, I think multi-purpose terminal, possibly in Trieste in Italy. And he's going to talk about Trieste, the Adriatic gateway for Central and Eastern Europe. Antonio, welcome.
Thank you so much. And this is the last speech. I'll try to be fast, and I hope that this will support me, because it's the last challenge that we have. So as you see, this is a complete new terminal, which comes from the merge of 2 terminals. It's part of a bigger vision. A vision about a different gateway to support the supply chain of the Central and Eastern Europe. So this diversification is always a way to reduce the risk and to improve the reliability of the supply chain. So let's start with a few words with what we are. So we are part of Hala. Hala is a leading European terminal and logistic group, which is owned by 69% of the city of Hamburg, and 31% is floating on the free markets. Okay, and well diversified in container, intermodal, logistic, and real estate. Part of Hala is Hala International. HIG is the international box which controls and manages all the terminal out of the town of Hamburg. Essentially, we are in Estonia, we are in Ukraine, we own a railway company in Ukraine as well, and a project logistic company with different sites in Poti, Tbilisi, and Baku. And last but not least, for me at least, PLT, which is a greenfield terminal, multi-purpose, and is essentially the first independent and common user terminal in Trieste area. What we believe, we have a vision of a connecting facility. So there is a huge market in Europe with different way and different connection, and the north and the south can be in synergy connection through an efficient intermodal network to connect the different markets and create to secure the market and to connect the different facilities in order to improve the value of the services. What we see, there are, you see where the arrows is Trieste position in the North Adriatic, which is well located for the South Mediterranean, the Middle East and the Far East flows, is in really central position for the Central Europe and East Europe as well, where according to our view, these economies are really resilient to the crisis. There is there is a need to keep a sea connection for the landlocked countries in the Central and in Eastern Europe as well. And there is even a way to reduce CO2 connection. So we will see in the latter slides that for this kind of flows, so from the Levant area of the Mediterranean and from whatever comes from Suez, this way is the shortest way. That means even less CO2 emission as well. It's not just a matter of less CO2 emission, so not just, we are talking just bunker, but we are even talking about 6 days around of shelf life more. So the goods arrives earlier and can stay longer in the supermarket, especially perishable goods to be sold. And even for the money, the capital, that the assets which are represented by vessel, by container, and by the goods inside the container, being 6-7 days earlier in the market means to have a faster turnover of the capital as well. And one of the view of these different additional routes to these countries is the growth factor, which is where the north-west range keeps on growing at a 2-3% percentage, while the growth on the southern route is recovering, so is around 6%, with 12% coming from Trieste area. One of the key factors is even the sea motorways and growth in this area, which is a really alternative to the land route to Austria, Hungary, and Germany for the goods which are mainly produced today in Turkey, where there has been a really good shift from the road to the sea trade, with a huge improvement of reliability of the transportation and even reduction of CO2 as well. That's more or less what we are doing, what we are taking, and we are talking about. And one of the big limits that today is in the North Adriatic is the availability of port infrastructure. Which are able to host the biggest vessel. So the shipping line are growing to 24,000 TEUs vessel. Today the highest capacity is 15,000, 18,000 TEUs vessel, while there is natural draft and the capability to build up a new infrastructure to support even the 24,000 TEUs vessel. And this vision works together with an efficient intermodal connectivity, which was one of the key factors for Trieste area to develop. And essentially, 1 year ago, our port was a totally empty ground, a concrete ground, with no vessel, with no any shipping line. And in 1 year time, we grown up with the 7 regular services, and we're growing more and more the intermodal connectivity. Today, we have a ratio which is between 50 and 60% of intermodal shift, and we see that more and more there is the need to connect as a gateway the sea with the intermodal connection. And this is our vision. You saw at the beginning, you saw the small terminal where we are, and by the dotted line, you see what the Harbor Master Plan allows us to build. And we have a challenging project which we are developing and where we trust, because essentially I moved 1 year ago to Trieste strongly believing in this project to build up the first really ultra large container vessel terminal in the North Adriatic. It will be built up in different phases, and we'll have the first phase almost 1 million TEUs capacity, the second phase and the third phase up to 1,600,000 TEUs capacity. And will be well connected with, of course, it will be an automated terminal. We are working on different solutions. And the gateway is really well matched with the railway, which is on the back side of the terminal. So we are planning to have 2 berths for 24,000 TEUs vessel, but enough rail capacity to reach Austria, Germany, the Baltic, and the eastern country. There will be a terminal, a rail terminal, which will be strongly connected with the sea flows of 9 rail tracks in the European standard by 750 meters. By 2023, all the network from Trieste to Tarvisio, which is the exchange to Villach and Austria, will be ready for the 750 meters, so increasing the capacity and increasing the economy and even the sustainability of the transportation by rail. There is a new rail station under projecting and which will be delivered by 2026, which will increase the shunting capacity to 10 rail tracks by 10 shunting tracks dedicated. Good music. And we are developing not just, since we are a totally greenfield terminal, we are going to build up the infrastructure. In our way, there is even the evaluation of a really, really innovative system for handling container. So this is one of the sites we are today discussing about choosing a mature technology like AGV and ASC. But on the other side, we are even thinking about to work on a carbon positive container handling facility, which really suits well due to the high intensive stack capacity with the need of building less terminal on the sea or less constrict on the sea, and which has a good advantage for especially for Trieste area, because Trieste is a quite windy area with winds which once a year blows around 200 kilometers per hour, but keeps on blowing a few days a year up to 150 kilometers per hour. So where we can improve in a safe and in a positive environmental impact, a total new technology. This is what we are working about, and since we were talking about how to reduce the congestion in the port, how to explore different routes for the same market, which means providing reliability to the logistic chain and diversifying the supply chain of the biggest European producer, and even about how to reduce the impact of logistics on our environment. This was our project, our vision, which more or less fits well with all what has been discussed up to now. So I would like to thank you for your patience and for listening to me, and welcome back to finally an opportunity where we can see our faces and we can shake our hands, which was one of the best things that we had today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonio, for giving us a full brief on HALA PLT and the very ambitious expansion plan there as well. So if I could invite all the speakers onto the stage for the Q&A. Unfortunately, Dr. Jan Hoffman cannot make the Q&A, but I'm sure with these three gentlemen, we can certainly have some interesting debate. And I'll just kick off the questions. And it's a very straightforward question. We're talking about rerouting, we're talking about possible changes in hub strategies by the carriers and so on. Looking 4 to 5 years ahead, do we see transshipment increasing or decreasing? And do we see a change in the existing global order of transshipment hubs? And I'll start with you, Johan, on that one.
Thank you. Our personal view, I think there are two balancing factors. One is there will probably be a case for more direct port protocols, which would reduce the need for transshipment, especially with ports upgrading. But then I think the overwhelming effect would be the things that I discussed earlier on in my presentation, the large additional volume of big vessels coming on stream. When disruption have eased a bit, there will be a renewed focus on reducing the cost again, and especially the relocation of the production supply chain to whether it's Southeast Asia, Central America, or Southern America. Smaller ports bringing in bigger volumes, that probably will go via transshipment activity. So two balancing acts where I think two balancing factors where it's the one would be an increase of transshipment.
Okay, Dennis?
I would probably say, it's similar sort of to the mixed bag, and I just remind ourselves to look at what the airline industry or what the airliners are doing. Basically, we've had massive sort of hub and spoke concepts. We've all seen the A380. We're seeing it disappear, and I guess there is a real case to be made for. High volume, high intense sort of direct routing opportunities, which will be underpinned somehow, obviously, by some of the transshipment. I guess what we're also seeing, though, is, at least in some discussions we're having with some ports, the willingness to go bigger and bigger and bigger at all cost is going down. Just because people realize that the effect on hinterland supply chains and all that is so significant that there's a stronger consideration of the total cost impact. So, as I said, it's probably a combination of the two phenomena. All things considered, I do not think we will have sort of massive increases in transshipment to be expected.
Okay. And Antonio, obviously with HALA PLT, that seems to have been developed primarily for the transit business into Eastern and Central Europe. But is there a transshipment component within the Adriatic to your development?
I guess that is mainly a matter of connectivity. So the North Adriatic has two components, has the gateway components, but there are ports in the North Adriatic and Adriatic which may be convenient to be served by feedering. So it's whenever you have choices or whenever the market is able to provide different solutions, and since not every port can be big enough to carry the low cost per unit from the big distance, there will be, even in the North Adriatic, which is not an island like Malta, or is not in the center of the Mediterranean like Gioia Tauro, but even in this case, you can have a limited quantity of transshipment in the traditional sense, so on the seaway, and the development as a through intermodal as a gateway for a wider region.
And while you're on, obviously there's quite a lot of competition in this part of the North Adriatic. Copa and Rijeka are also trying to sort of develop and expand their transit opportunities. Where's the unique selling point that Hala PLT has over those other competitors?
So there is first of all, there is as our value, we are a multi-user and open terminal. So we belong to a professional terminal operator, and there's no any different integration interest on us. But what I think is that is a new route, is a clean and environmental sustainable route, and more than competition. We think that the cake is going to be bigger, so the global trade is not going to lower. Somehow it little decreased during the COVID, so we could expect worse from this pandemic. So the global market and exchange will grow, and we expect that this trade is going to grow. So it's matter to have a bigger cake, not too much to divide the smaller cake. The actual smaller cake between more partners.
Okay, thank you. Do I have any questions from below? Come on, there's been lots of issues, lots of topics discussed this afternoon. Eleanor, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, from the experience looking at the small to medium-sized ports, to what extent are we seeing those ports make the necessary interactions with the inland transport networks that are required to service the increased volume? So we know it takes a long while to expand a port. How long to get the intermodal connections if you're a secondary US port up and running? Or is there a risk that you may end up with all the terminal and port capacity you need, but not actually the connectivity to your hinterland markets or your target markets?
Okay, Dennis. Sorry, I was looking around for another question as well.
That's okay. I was curious whether you actually sort of pointed the question to an individual or not. But I would say by the time you understand what the connectivity requirements are, and subject obviously to there being capacity available, if you need to build a lot of rail lines or expand the rail terminal, obviously you're still sort of back to infrastructure development, which takes some time. But especially in these days where people see crunches in the supply chain, the willingness to try different things has proven to be possible inside 9 months or so. Again, subject to there being rolling stock available, to there being the other infrastructure available. It's all about understanding where that bottleneck is, because obviously you can invest as much as you want in an inland terminal. If there's one bridge over which all the trains need to go, that's limiting your capacity. That's the key thing you need to understand, of course. But if that's available, it can be done really, really quickly.
Antonio, do you have a perspective?
I'm more or less aligned. So you need to plan, and you need to have a good shared plan with all the stakeholders, which is not the easiest things to do. And since we have a lot of supplier in equipment in this conference, nowadays you need to be really good friends of them, because the lead time to have a piece of equipment is becoming longer and longer.
Johan?
No, in general, I fully agree with what being said. I think a lot of the smaller terminals in the last 2 or 3 years, the discussion that we had were just also overwhelmed, and they have to get back into the idea of focusing on those kind of bottlenecks as well. It's also a lack of resources focusing on different problems, especially in the smaller and medium-sized terminals. This is quite often the case.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, I'll just ask one final question then, and it relates, Johan, to your presentation. And I think you made the comment about building in more resilience in container terms. And I just wonder what you envisage how that resilience can be built into container terminals, and also whether the integrated port approach that Dennis referred to can be a factor in that as well.
Yeah, I think the resilience can come in different flavors, and one is indeed the interaction with the entire supply chain. It can also be the simple things as just additional capacity in cases where that was a problem. or when it was the gates, when it was about partnerships. I think it comes in a whole lot of flavors, but the problems with that is it needs an additional investment, and the question is whether the return will be there when the situation changes. So with the resilience, you have to add the word flexibility to it, because the resilience or the additional capacity, or how you want to do it, it needs to be a flexible solution to change to the new situation.
Okay. And in the examples you used, Dennis, has that helped in terms of relieving congestion in the terminals and so on?
Absolutely, and I give you probably on the basis of the example of Christchurch, just because it's such a small terminal, and the port sits right next to a hill. What they've been able to do is move most of their cargo, especially imports, and each and every O&D focused terminal knows the unpredictability of import container pickups. What it has allowed them to do is do block stack imports, literally for high, move them to the rail, off to the inland terminal, and with that increase the yard capacity by about 25%, and the hugely expensive expansion of the port has been delayed, obviously at the cost of an increase in the inland terminal, but the inland terminal cost, or the development cost for the inland terminal on a like-for-like basis, is just under 20% of that for the terminal. Now, as and when there's the time to expand the terminal in terms of key line, obviously there's no more wiggle room. But the pressing issue being the yard congestion, that's what they could very clearly help.
Okay. And in turn, Hala, how important is your intermodal company in helping relieve some of the congestion in your terminals on a broader perspective?
It's definitely supporting to have your own intermodal company, but we have partnership with a different intermodal company. Having a quick solution and a reliable partner, if are part of the company, it helps. But essentially, it helps to have the right information earlier and to elaborate and to work on that information the soonest as possible.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. One last opportunity. Okay, a question over here. Thank you, sir.
I have a question for Antonio. You've elaborated in your presentation about how Trieste can be a big platform for Central Europe and Eastern Europe, where the competitors are Hamburg, Rotterdam, and Polish ports. How do you see Trieste's position to serve Balkan countries like Serbia, Bosnia, where your competitors would be more Greek ports and maybe Black Sea ports, who have an advantage on the sea leg, but maybe not as good rail connection compared to Trieste?
So what is your advantage today may not be your advantage tomorrow, because the infrastructure can develop, and we hope that infrastructure develop. We see a strong position, and we see a strong position even based on the fact that there is a natural draft and a huge turning basin for the biggest vessel. The position is central to the Central and the East Europe. And again, the vision is that I really trust that the cake is going to be bigger. So it's not really a competition to the north. It's not really competition to the new ports which are going on the east side of the Adriatic, but is a matter how to better serve the markets and the industries and the GDO, which is going to somehow support emergency in country and emergency in fast-growing economy on the eastern side, and growing at a lower path, but still growing economy in the Central Europe. So competition is a bad word. So we think that there is a lot of potential growth which it needs to be served. So there is much more an offer of service. We need to catch the demand rather than a demand that needs to be shared between many different offerings.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So I'll close this session now with a big thanks to Jan, who unfortunately wasn't able to stay to the end, to Johan, to Dennis, and to Antonio for the time spent in putting their presentations together and their time in delivering them to us this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.